So he is going to be talking about Evangeline Wilbour Blashfield, partially because of her impact on monumental art in public. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Brown, and we will be doing some question periods, but please feel free to send me any questions that you have in the chat at any time. I will just save them, and then you don't have to try to remember, and I will relay those to Dr. Brown at the appropriate periods. Dr. Brown?
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Marjorie. I want to thank Little Compton and the Little Compton Historical Society, both for hosting me in my past research and for inviting me tonight to give this talk on Evangeline Wilbour Blashfield, who is a most extraordinary figure who has brought so much interest and meaning to my research, and it really has become a kind of hero and kindred spirit for me over the past couple of years. So I feel very close to Little Compton for that reason, and Little Compton was very close and important to Evangeline. Evangeline Wilbour Blashfield, scholar, author, activist, muse. She is today, however, almost completely unknown. In fact, if you learn anything about Evangeline Wilbour Blashfield today, it must happen almost by accident. If you are, for instance, in Manhattan, on 59th Street, at the end by the Queensboro Bridge, you might, as you're looking for a place to sit, pass by the beginning of the bridge on the Manhattan side, and as this woman sees, find a little track that leads by the side of the bridge into a sheltered small park, nestled against the bridge by an old market, the Bridge Market, which was established in the early 20th century there underneath the brand new steel iron girder bridge. In this space, you will find a mosaic depicting a woman with vibrant red hair and a white peplous dress and a red outer garment, leaning against a cornucopia, the figure of abundance. But to learn that this monument is dedicated to a woman named Evangeline Wilbour Blashfield, you'll have to peek behind the branches of the trees, the bushes that have grown up around the monument since its rededication in 2003. Who is this Evangeline Wilbour Blashfield to have a monument dedicated to her in Midtown Manhattan underneath the Queensboro Bridge? This monument actually makes the list frequently of best kept secrets and most little known monuments in Manhattan on a regular basis. Who is this woman who has an annual memorial address dedicated to her by the American Academy of Arts and Letters, an address that has been given by John Updike and Edward Albee, many of the greatest writers and poets and playwrights of the last century, including in 2017, Joyce Carol Oates. Who is this Evangeline Wilbour Blashfield with a memorial address? I can tell you none of the givers of this address over the last century know anything about her, or at least for the last 75 years or so. The address is remembered today as the Edwin Blashfield address, although it was established by Edwin in honor of his wife, Evangeline, after her death. Who is this woman about whom the New York Times wrote in 2003 after the Municipal Art Society rededicated and restored her monument? Last week, 85 years after her death, Evangeline Wilbour Blashfield moved from the ranks of the forgotten to those of the vaguely remembered. That's in the New York Times, June 8, 2003. What a sad legacy for a woman who accomplished and did so much that has been forgotten. Her story is a story which is not uncommon, though. We have to remember that many women, of course, many great achievers of the past are forgotten. And in particular, many of the women in our history in the United States and in Western society generally. And it's here a wonderful opportunity in the month of March, Women's History Month, in a year dedicated to the women of Little Compton, 100 years after suffrage was passed in this country, an opportune moment to consider the contributions that Evangeline Wilbour Blashfield made, which have been unfortunately forgotten. I myself learned about Evangeline in a completely accidental way. A close friend of mine who collects American painting shared with me a work that really captured my interest, a painting by a man named Edwin Howland Blashfield, who is a figure who is known today as the most prolific and perhaps the most successful mural painter of in American history. A man who has painted the Capitol buildings and the Library of Congress and the banks and the public buildings in many of the great cities in the country. A man whose accomplishments are well remembered. This painting attracted me because it seemed, as I'll tell you later, like a very interesting picture offering insights into the inspirations, the ideas about art of this artist, Edwin Howland Blashfield. But it was only through sustained study of this that I rediscovered the identity of the woman in this picture, who is, of course, the same woman in the monument under the Queensborough Bridge, with the white peplos and the red outer garment and the vibrant red hair. It is Evangeline Blashfield herself, although I think, in fact, her hair was not red in real life. It was dark brown or auburn. Who was Evangeline Blashfield? She was born in Little Compton. Edwin wrote about her in a biography that he put together after her death, a biography that's never been published, that exists in a single manuscript copy in the archives of the New York Historical Society, in Edwin's collected papers. He wrote that the daughter, while yet in pigtails and short skirts, had listened to the friendly counsels of Susan B. Anthony, just as her mother before her remembered the kindly words of Margaret Fuller and the hand laid gently upon her head. She grew up with the new movement of American women. To woman, as an independent thinker, she was committed by mind, temperament, and indeed birthright. Born in Little Compton, the family lived at Awashonk, a Wilbur house at Little Compton, which no longer exists, which was demolished in the 1930s, although many of the artifacts from the house are today in the collection of Little Compton Historical Society. She was the daughter of two formidable individuals, Charlotte Beebe Wilbour, who was a suffragist and an activist, a close friend of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and who had grown up around Margaret Fuller. Her own mother, Sarah Sewell, actually Edwin's mother, Sarah Sewell Wilbour, was also a suffragist. So for generations, the Wilbour women had a keen interest in women's rights. She married, Charlotte Beebe, married Charles Edwin, the daughter of Sarah Sewell Wilbour, himself a fascinating figure, raised by a strong mother, married to a strong wife. And these are the parents then that raised young Evangeline. Sarah Sewell Wilbour, as I said, was already a woman interested in the women's movement in the 19th century, and a friend and associate of Margaret Fuller, one of the founding figures of American intellectual feminism. So Evangeline is coming from a background that is deeply rooted in women and their accomplishments as writers and thinkers. Charles Edwin, meanwhile, moved the family when Evangeline was a young girl to New York. Charles Edwin, who had attended Brown University, dropped out in his sophomore year due to illness. And after he recovered, found his footing in New York as a court reporter, and then as a journalist working for Horace Greeley, who was at the time perhaps the greatest newspaperman in America. Horace Greeley, a central and important American historical figure, took Charles Edwin under his wing. And Charles Edwin was something of a protege, a man of obvious talent and ability, who found friends easily and made his way quite easily in New York as well. Horace Greeley himself is remembered as a feminist. And we have several artifacts in the Little Compton Historical Society, which are really remarkable testimonies to the life of the family in New York. This is the seating chart in Charles Edwin's papers from the Charles Dickens dinner at Delmonico's in 1868, a very famous event actually in New York history, when the elderly Charles Dickens was brought into town and wined and dined at Delmonico's. We can see here Charles Dickens seated at the head table next to Horace Greeley. Over here is Charles Edwin Wilbour, and here the cartoonist Thomas Nast, who left us this drawing of the Delmonico dinner with Charles Dickens. Also among his effects in the LCH archives, we have a diagram of Delmonico's from November 27th, 1869, when Count Ferdinand de Lesseps was hosted by the men, the people of New York. And here is Horace Greeley seated next to Mrs. Wilbour, and Charles Edwin seated next to Mrs. Greeley here at one of the head tables. So Charles Edwin was well connected, and through his connections to Horace Greeley, he became connected to one of the most infamous men in New York history, the legendary or infamous Boss William Tweed, who is regarded as perhaps the most corrupt politician ever to have lived and worked in American history. Tweed recruited Charles Edwin to come over to his own paper, the New York Transcript, which he purchased in 1868, and to run both the New York Transcript and a printing house, which Tweed had acquired. Charles Edwin was willing to do so, and became thus a part of the Tammany Hall scandal that erupted in the early 1870s. This is actually a cartoon from the era, which involves Charles Edwin and his work at the printing company, which Tweed managed to obtain contracts for through the New York public school system to print all the textbooks in the district. And it was a cash cow, along with the New York Transcript, which profited enormously from the city's advertising, which was directed almost exclusively to the New York Transcript during this era. When the Tweed scandal broke, Charles Edwin and all of the other associates of Boss Tweed were placed in a very difficult position. Their reputations tarnished, whether or not they had actually profited from the schemes of Tweed. Charles Edwin almost certainly, of course, had. He was from not an impecunious background, but neither was he rich. After the Tweed affair, Charles Edwin was independently wealthy, and the family was quite rich. They had profited also from Charles Edwin's astute investment in Horace Greeley's newspaper, and a block of stock in the Tribune had grown considerably. So whether it was entirely Tweed money or not is open to debate, but certainly he had not been hurt by his association with Tweed financially. But Charles Edwin was a man of many talents. Where perhaps other Tweed cronies had nothing to fall back on, Charles Edwin was an intellectual of the first order. How he ever managed to fall into city politics and that kind of thing is hard to imagine, given his interests lay in such cerebral directions. He was the first English translator of Victor Hugo's works and a close friend of Victor Hugo. His translation of Les Miserables was the first English translation and has remained a standard into the 21st century, alongside other more recent translations. He named his son, in fact, Victor Hugo Wilbour, after his friend Victor Hugo. After the Tweed scandal broke, Charles Edwin, under the cloud of the scandal of Tammany Hall, himself never charged or indicted or even accused of anything specific, nevertheless found it difficult social going in New York, and moved the family for a time to Paris, where he embarked on an entirely new area of study as an Egyptologist, and became in short order one of the foremost Egyptologists in the world, and by far the founding figure and the most important figure in Egyptology in America, and was regarded at the time of his death as the greatest international expert on hieroglyphics. The museums of the United States of America, in particular the Brooklyn Museum, are stuffed with artifacts and documents and treasures of great historical value from Wilbour through his research in Egypt. Here he is among a who's who of 19th century Egyptologists who were his friends and associates. It was thus after the move to Paris, that Evangeline, at the age of just 15 or 16, becomes herself, grows into her own. She is, as Edwin remembers, a dynamic figure, bookish, intellectual, and surrounded by a who's who of Paris intellectuals, authors, playwrights, actors, and actresses. She, through her father's social network, had access to the great riches of the city of Paris in the 1870s. Edwin recalls, when I first met her at a dance in Paris, I suppose she was some 28 years old. She had the air shared by her sister of thinking that we dancing young men were less than nothing. Later, I learned that her 17th birthday was not far behind her. Yet given the quantity and quality of her learning, 28 years would have been all too few to seem reasonable. She was a born intellectual, had all of her father's intellectual gifts and all of her mother's passion for the history and the political condition of women. Here she is around 1882, so not during the Paris years, but slightly later perhaps. Or arguably slightly younger. I don't have an actual firm date for this photograph. And given her age, it could be, I suppose, anywhere between roughly 25 and 22 or so years of age, or 15 and 22 years of age. It was in Paris that Evangeline met Edwin Howland Blashfield. Evangeline, 10 years his junior, was only 17 when they met. And he, 27, 28 years old, was a young American student of painting in the atelier of Léon Bonnat, who was at the time a major French painter and teacher of painters. Here is Edwin in about 1882 with rather ridiculous mustachios. But this is how he must have appeared when he met Evangeline in the early days of their acquaintance. He was a painter of considerable talent, although before he met Evangeline, of considerable emptiness as well. All he made were pictures of women in fancy dress, which he sold to make money to go to parties, as he records in his own diaries and memoirs and reminiscences. He made silly pictures without any real content or sense of direction or purpose beyond being effective executions of paint on canvas. He certainly had the technical ability, but it wasn't until he met Evangeline that he begins to do anything interesting. In 1876, when he met her, suddenly this peplos-wearing, white peplos-wearing, red-robed gypsy woman appears in Edwin's paintings, suggesting a new romantic direction in his pictures. And then suddenly his paintings take a deeply archaeological turn at the same moment that he begins courting a young woman whose father is the foremost American archaeologist of his generation. And suddenly his paintings take an even more interesting turn as he begins to paint unheard of subjects, women gladiators, fencing and taking lessons in the gladiatorial schools of ancient Rome, subjects which are both archaeological and driven by an interest in the identities and the roles of women. This is a particularly compelling example, a painting whose title in Latin, Ad spice quo fremitu monstratos perferet ictus, means, behold with what resounding noise she beareth the well-taught blows. It's a really interesting picture on so many levels, as it abandons all of the masculine tropes of classical subject matter and takes as its subject this image of two well-muscled women beating each other with swords, dressed in the gladiatorial costume of the day. I'm not sure whether I consider this to be a kind of women's lib subject of painting, but I can tell you no one else is doing anything like this at the time. Where does he get this idea from? Where is it coming from? I can tell you there's only one potential source. It must be from Evangeline and her family, as we will see. He was in fact chastised for this in the American press. At the time, he was quite a prestigious young painter because he was in this exclusive French studio. And this painting, which made quite a success and traveled around and toured the country, in fact, it attracted negative notice in American art journals, which thought it was unseemly to have women clubbing each other with swords. They ought to be dressed in finery and perfuming themselves and dining on grapes and that sort of thing. So in 1881, the couple marry and return to New York. Edwin writes of this time, "We were married on July 5th, 1881. At once, her mental and physical journeys began, and her attempts at realization of the wedding or divorce between her own idea of life and that of the people whom she revered or who entertained her in history or fiction. Whenever we could find time and money, we followed them about, her people, real or imaginary." Evangeline was a historian. She was fascinated throughout her life by the people of fiction, by the people who wrote historical fiction, by the people of history, writers, authors, artists, intellectuals. She is, in fact, one of the first historians of women, and of historians of women artists and authors. When they moved to New York, however, they moved into the artist studios at West 57th Street, the Sherwood Artist Studios, and were surrounded by a bohemian collection of other artists, including many young women artists of the day, whose names are unfortunately, many of them not particularly well known to us, precisely because of the condition that besets Evangeline, that is, the difficulty of women attracting fame and gaining entrance to a market. We note that Evangeline is a scholar, and as we'll talk about in our talk, her scholarship is remarkable, but she had no formal education, nor indeed any access to formal education beyond finishing school in Florence at the age of 17. Her pursuits, her intellectual attainments, were those entirely of her own grit and resolve and desire and determination. Now, of course, she had unusual access through her father and through her parents. She had resources, she had means, unlike so many others, but nonetheless, she had no access to graduate schools and to colleges and universities or professors. She was her own teacher in many respects. When they returned to New York, Edwin tried his hand at being a good commercially successful artist, which meant trying to figure out what Americans wanted to buy. And so he abandoned all of his these huge archaeological pictures that he painted in Paris and started painting these American scenes, including on the right, a scene of the people of Boston watching the firing at Bunker Hill, American historical scenes that were patriotic, or images of American child life, like this little boy dressed in his child dress on the left, with his toy soldiers being cleared off the table, and the whimsical title, Waterloo, Total Defeat. It wasn't until 1882, late in 1882, that he painted what I think is probably his most important early painting. And it is an image of Evangeline. He returns to his muse. He returns really, I think, to the intellectual force behind his work. The painting is both beautiful and I think interesting. It is entitled A Modern Rebecca. Rebecca, the biblical wife of Isaac, who was identified as a wife and a spouse for Isaac by the servant Eliezer, who went searching for a wife for Isaac. And he said, whoever is the woman who brings water to my camels at the well, that will be the good helpmeet for Isaac. And so he goes to the well, and many of the women there ignore him. And one comes up and says, let me bring water for your camels. This is the future wife of Isaac. Rebecca is in the biblical tradition of biblical women, thus a good, dutiful servant, a caretaker, one who is in all the domestic ways a virtuous wife. So there's a play here, the young newly married couple, Edwin and Evangeline dressing up and performing here by this modern 19th century American well, the role of the ideal biblical wife, Rebecca. She is quite clearly based on the image of Evangeline, as this later portrait of Evangeline by Edwin reveals to us. But I think there's something interesting and coy going on here. A year later, and this is a wonderful piece of Little Compton history, we find this fantastic photograph of life in the summer in Little Compton, 1883, perhaps 6 months after Edwin has painted this picture of a modern Rebecca featuring Evangeline. We're at the Burleigh Place, which was a center of activity and creativity in Little Compton back in those days, in 1883. And we've been playing charades or play acting. Edwin actually writes about this in his biography of Evangeline. He says, in our early summers, Evangeline acted as an amateur theater troupe director, and she would engage us in all sorts of amusements and play acting. And here, all of the folks who are assembled have identified personalities. They've dressed up, and clearly they're having the picture made after having done their performances. We see a variety of historical figures. There's St. Catherine with her spinning wheel. There's Nero here fiddling on a tennis racket while Rome burns, presumably. And there is Mrs. Blashfield as Rebecca at the well. What a wonderful conjunction. The modern Rebecca painting was made just before this. And here in their summer play acting, Rebecca and Edwin, or Evangeline and Edwin, dress up as Rebecca. But Mr. Blashfield, E.H., Edwin Howland, does not dress as Isaac, the spouse of Rebecca. He dresses instead as Jacob, Rebecca's son. That is a fascinating commentary on their relationship, that in their play acting here, Evangeline plays Edwin's mother. It says something, I think, certainly about the influence that she had on the direction of his work. These images of the play acting and the summer amusements in Little Compton reflect likewise on the Evangeline's interest in theater. In fact, Edwin says that her education, because it was not formal, was very much an education of the theater in Paris, in New York. And she sought out the great works of theater and the great artists of the theater as her friends and associates. Here we see Victor Wilbour on the left as Mephistopheles, and Edwin Blashfield over here as Edwin C. Frost. Back to our picture of Rebecca in this image. It's a painting that connects us to one aspect of Evangeline's interest, her interest in theater, which became Edwin's interest in theater. Just a year after that painting, the two of them set about writing the very first of their published articles. It's an article entitled Pictorial Art on the Stage, and it wasn't published until 1887, but they had completed the first draft of this by 1883. And in it, it is very much a manifesto for Edwin's painting. It describes a certain pictorial ideal. That is the ideal of the picture on the stage in those quiet moments in a theatrical performance. Not the parts where the actors are speaking, but the scene setting parts, when the curtain goes up and all we have is the painted backdrop, the furniture, the architecture of the stage, the costumes of the figures, and the body languages as the actors find their spots, hit their marks, and assume and embody the characters of the figures they portray. Those moments, those visual panoramas, those scena, are the very subject of this text, in which Evangeline, who wrote it almost entirely by herself, lays out a vision of what Edwin and she began to call the decorative style in 19th century painting. Decorative in the sense that it doesn't tell stories, except through costume and form and figure and posture, through setting, as the stage does when the actors are not speaking. Through Evangeline, Edwin and Evangeline became deeply enmeshed in the New York theater scene. When the Irving Lyceum Company, the most important English Shakespearean company of the day, came through New York, Evangeline made friends with all of them. And here from 1885 is Edwin Howland's painting of Norman Forbes Robertson, one of the foremost actors of the day, who became close friends with him while touring through New York. Among their effects in New York and the Historical Society are notes and letters and portraits and photographs from Henry Irving, the founder of the Lyceum Company, and Ellen Terry, the foremost leading actress of the day, who was a few years later painted by John Singer Sargent, Edwin's close friend, in her role as Lady Macbeth, one of Sargent's most famous paintings. Annie Russell, who is a New York leading lady and herself a fascinating historical figure as a woman. In 1912, Annie Russell was approaching the late period of her career as a leading lady in her mid to late 40s, and she found it hard to find suitable roles. And so she decided, with the encouragement of Evangeline Blashfield, to go into business for herself, and became, in that year, the first woman to produce on Broadway. That is, to lease her own theater, to produce her own production, and to star in her own production, 1912. It was quite an event in the day. It's written up in all the newspapers and journals, and was considered to be an astonishing demonstration of women's ability to handle both the front end and the back end side of theatrical production. Evangeline was crucial in giving Annie the confidence in order to do that. Our painting of Evangeline as Rebecca reveals not only her interest in play and theatrical performance, but also her growing fascination with an unusual antiquity, these Tanagra figurines, which were ancient Greek terracotta statuettes found in the graves of the ancient Greek city of Tanagra, and they began to be excavated in the 1870s. They were kind of a rage at the moment. And as you can see, I believe her posture on the left is very much based on the type of this standing Tanagra figurine on the right-hand side. Evangeline was quite interested in them. In fact, all art collectors and painters of the day were fascinated by them, because these Tanagra figurines, unlike most ancient Greek sculptures, were painted. And it was fascinating to people in a world of white marble Greek monuments to see Greek statuary covered in pigment. That was particularly interesting to artists like Edwin Blashfield, but it was fascinating as well to Evangeline for yet another reason. Evangeline and other early feminist intellectuals saw the Tanagra figurines as important monuments for the history of women. They were completely different than the kinds of monuments, the marble pantheon, the Parthenons, and the statuary of the ancient Greeks, which were made by famous male artists, Phidias and Praxiteles. These anonymous little objects made of clay, often mold formed, that depicted no known subjects, they don't depict gods and goddesses, and are by unknown artists, and that depict almost exclusively women, were a fascinating subject for a group of female intellectuals, including Mary F. Curtis, who is the cousin of John Singer Sargent, and an early art historian in her own right, who published in 1879 this book, Tanagra Figurines, in which she lays out the idea that the discovery of the Tanagra figurines is a new beginning for the archaeology and the history of women. Tanagra figurines and this decorative theatrical style become the new hallmark of Edwin Blashfield's painting from 1883 onward. And as we see here in this long frieze-like painting at the top, he's borrowing the Tanagra figurines, their dress, their coloration as models for his figures. As in this print after a painting by Edwin, which I fear is lost, at least I have not found it, but one of his most important works from this period, 1882, Autumn, in which we see the pose is adapted from the Tanagra figurine, and undoubtedly the coloration would have been as well, although we no longer know what the colors were like. In 1885, Edwin produces this large exhibition piece entitled Under the Temple Eaves, which extends this idea of the Tanagra, of painting on sculpture, even further. In this image, we are under the temple eaves of the Parthenon, the famous marble temple of Athens. And here a sculptor is at work on a scaffolding. You can see his hammer is laid aside and his chisel is there as he welcomes this bright and beautiful woman clad in a diaphanous flowing garment into the upper reaches of the Parthenon, where clearly the sculptor is still at work carving the sculptures. The woman is based, quite obviously, on the image of Evangeline in this early portrait. And she is bearing into the upper reaches of the Parthenon, in the shadows under the eaves. She's bearing the light and the color from down below. You can see she glows and is quite radiant. whereas the young, dark, swarthy looking man who reaches to lift her up is dark, like his sculpture, all in shadow behind him. In this picture, Blashfield is making an even more interesting point, which is that not just the color and the light that comes from the natural light of Athens, but also the color of pigment itself was applied to these stones. On a higher scaffolding here, we see a table with a little pot and the stems of paintbrushes sticking out of it. That is the painter's pot. As Edwin Blashfield himself wrote in an article shortly after Evangeline's death, he and many other painters and archaeologists of the time believed that the Parthenon itself must have been painted, that the white marble stones so familiar to our eye, the lithic textures of ancient sculpture, would all have been colored, would all have been painted with vibrant hues. This is not only the personification of color, Evangeline coming into the upper reaches of the temple, it is the painter herself. For in fact, Evangeline points out in her writings, according to classical mythological legend, the inventor of painting was a woman. According to this account, this legend, the daughter of a sculptor named Debudides, we only know her as the daughter of Debudides, was the first person to paint, the first person, in fact, to be a muralist, to paint on the wall, when she traced and then colored the silhouette of her lover from a shadow that he cast upon the wall. This legend then is a kind of foundation legend that's brought back in Evangeline's interpretation of the woman painter rising into the upper reaches of the temple of sculpture to bring color and light to the dark and lithic walls of the Parthenon. He develops, Edwin, this idea of the woman as light and color, as paint on the stones, as painting herself through a series of pictures, including the painting that I started my research with. This is a wonderful image, again, based on the portrait of Evangeline. As we saw years later, after her death, this image was reused by Edwin Blashfield in the memorial that was dedicated to her in her honor. It is also a figure based on the Tanagra Figurines, which, as we recall, were painted figurines that embodied this idea of sculpture that is painted, of a sculptural surface brought to life through the hues of life. In our picture in front of us, there are a variety of Tanagra figurines that are posed on this little table in front of the woman, who is herself a living Tanagra figurines. In the painting, the Tanagra figurines are quite faded. Their pigments are ancient and they're dulled by time, whereas the woman is alive and contemporary and vibrant. She sits, moreover, as you can see, on a marble relief which is itself quoted from the stones of the Parthenon. Color is once again upon the stones of the Parthenon in this image. It's an allegory that's based on the literal, figural relationship of the woman seated atop the stone as color is restored to its rightful place on the stones of the Parthenon sculptures. This series of paintings that Edwin made in 1883, 1884, 1885 were extremely important for the development of his ideas. Edwin was not yet at this point a muralist, as he would become later in his career. He painted on easels. But he obtained at this moment in 1883, through the combined efforts of Evangeline and his own new explorations, perhaps the most important mural commission of the 1880s in a series of ceiling paintings, which no longer exist, unfortunately, for the house of a member of the Vanderbilt family, the Twombly House at Fifth Avenue. These were an important contribution in 1883, widely documented in the art press of the day, and that helped to create a new market for mural painting, which was quite uncommon in America at this time, because as Evangeline and Edwin pointed out, America was not yet in a great building phase. There were no public monuments to speak of that boasted rich painting programs or decorative schemes, and there was no public support for that kind of public art. And thus it was only the houses of the private rich men who could afford such things that mural painters even had an outlet for their work. Edwin thus became, through he and through Evangeline's combined efforts, he became a painter of murals and one of the leading figures at the beginning of a moment in time when America turned toward public art and mural painting. In fact, I believe it was Evangeline, although we may never find the definitive historical proof, that pushed Edwin in this direction. Edwin, who had been, before he met her, a feckless and directionless artist, and who found in his relationship with Evangeline the richest themes of his art, I think she envisioned him as doing something more important than easel painting. Easel paintings, which could be sold primarily only to private individuals and decorate the private houses of the wealthy. For Evangeline, who was always interested in public access to beauty, she conceived of mural painting as she knew it in Paris, as she knew it in Europe from her childhood there, her late adolescence, as she knew public art in general in Europe, as this new and bright and hopeful future for a wealthy American nation that was willing to invest public money in public access to beauty. Here we see Edwin returning to the theme of the Tanagra and to the theme of painted sculpture. And here from 1886, another fascinating picture, which is almost like a prophecy. It depicts the story of Bramante showing the plans for the new St. Peter's to the Pope. This is the great Renaissance story of the rebuilding of St. Peter's, which has one of the most marvelous painted domes in anywhere in the world. I love this picture because the plan itself is just a white diagram. And Bramante is there at the Pope's elbow, asking him to imagine what it could be. It hasn't been built yet. It requires the Pope's commitment. It requires the money and the investment to make this great thing come to be. You have to have vision. You have to have vision for this kind of thing. It doesn't just happen. And so Edwin Blashfield, the future muralist, is envisioning a world in which our own popes, our own powers that be, take an interest in the public's interest in art and spend money on creating aesthetic access and on bringing beauty to the people. Here, one of the last paintings from this series is Evangeline again. As a painter herself now, holding the brush in her hand, she is a vase painter in ancient Greece. And once again, this is like the image of the Tanagra Figurines. It's a sculptural form, a mural form in some ways, which is now the vehicle for painting. The marriage of these two things, form and space and color, are brought together in this image with, once again, the image of the female painter at the center of it, which I think, again, must for us allude to Evangeline's enormous influence on Edwin's ideas, that he casts her here in his picture as the author of the work itself. That picture was painted in 1876, and it was painted in a very special place. In fact, it's one of the few paintings that we can date securely because there's a sticker still affixed to the back that's original to the frame that tells us it was painted in England at Broadway at an artists' colony, which was run by a friend of Edwin Blashfield, Frank Millet, an American artist who lived much of his life in England. And that summer, 1876, was a special one. A large group of close friends, Edwin Austin Abbey and John Singer Sargent, Frank Millet, Edwin Blashfield, among others, were all gathered together here at Broadway, living together, painting together, sharing dinner every night and talking. And they shared their ideas. It was at that site, at this place, where Evangeline and Edwin are developing their ideas and ambitions for mural painting, that they shared, I think, with their friends, a vision of the future of American art. As it happens, every single one of those people would go on to become a great and important muralist in the American tradition of the late 19th and early 20th century. Edwin Austin Abbey, John Singer Sargent, Edwin Blashfield, and Frank Millet 4 artists together at that moment in time, forming their ambitions for a bold future of public art in America. It was in 1876, at this summer together, that John Singer Sargent painted his famous Carnation Lily, Lily Rose, which is one of his most beloved and beautiful works. Perhaps almost the last painting on canvas that Edwin made is this, a portrait of his wife, Evangeline, from 1889. After 1889, it's very difficult to find easel paintings by Edwin. He seems to have abandoned the mode almost entirely. In fact, the few paintings he did make were monumental in scale. I mean, astonishingly large. His largest, which is in the Brooklyn Museum, measures some 25 feet in width and length. Hardly a work that you can hang on your wall. He is envisioning a world of monumental painting. He just doesn't have the buildings for it to go on yet. Until 1893, in the Chicago World's Fair, the World's Columbian Exposition, which was a turning point in American public art. It was an event that so astonished America about what was possible in the architecture and the decoration of public buildings, that it kicked off an era that we still sometimes call the American Renaissance. It is the era during which every single one of our beautiful courthouses, our Capitol buildings, our public libraries, all of those great buildings that occupy the downtowns of every American city, from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the North to the South. If you look, almost every single one of those buildings was constructed between 1893 and the Great Depression, as a result, in part, of the energy that came out of this great international event. Well, Edwin Blashfield's friend, Frank Millet, who had hosted them in Broadway just a few years before, was tapped as the director of decoration for the American buildings at the Columbian Exposition. And he brought home Edwin and all of his friends to decorate the building. These paintings no longer exist, but we have here a photograph of one of Edwin's installations at the site. And from that moment on, Edwin was perhaps the most famous mural painter in America. If we'd like to pause now, I'd be happy to take questions about the first part of Evangeline's life.
Okay, so if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and enter them in the chat, send them to me, and I will relay them to Dr. Brown. We'll give folks a minute or two to find the chat. If you are on a PC, it's in the bottom bank of buttons towards the center. There's a little speech bubble. If you are on a mobile device, it would be up in the top corner. You'll have the 3 dots to open a menu, and from there you can open the chat. Apparently you've been encyclopedic so far. Nobody has sent anything yet. So we'll let you keep going. And if folks have questions that they want to put in now, I'll make sure they get asked at the end.
So as we turn now to Evangeline as a scholar in her own right, I should say that she and Edwin published together, beginning with that article that I've already showed you, Pictorial Art on the Stage, over a dozen articles. She is listed as a co-author. But this doesn't give full justice to our understanding of her as an author. She was probably the author in her own right of almost all of these works. Edwin furnished the illustrations for them, and no doubt made contributions here and there depending on the subject matter. But Edwin himself is quite clear about this in his reminiscences, that these were her ideas and these were her interests that they were exploring together. From 1887 onward, Edwin and Evangeline lived abroad until 1893 when they returned to America. And it was during this period that they began to publish really intensively about Egypt, about the Renaissance in Florence, about medieval France, about a wide variety of subjects, all focused around art history, which was a discipline in its earliest infancy. There was perhaps only one art history professor in all of America at the time that they were writing. And here is an image of the 7 Hathors, which was Charles Edwin's dahabia, his boat that they lived on while they were in Egypt. Here is the cover of their essay, The Art of Ravenna, which appeared in 1892. And you can see E.H. and E.W. Blashfield. But in the manner of the way that we are guilty of historical omission, it's always Edwin who is remembered as the author. His name appears first, her name appears under his, and she has been erased from our memory of the authorship of these texts, despite the fact that they reflect entirely her intellectual interests. That's true again in 1893, when Evangeline became the founder of the Municipal Art Society, which is the very first such organization in the entire country. Now almost every city in the country has its Municipal Art Society, its Arts Commission, its Arts Foundation, a public civically oriented arts organization. The very first one was founded in 1893 in New York by Evangeline Wilbour Blashfield. It was organized by her in a meeting of the who's who of New York art and economic community. She wrote the address that was delivered by her husband at the founding meeting of the society. And you can see here, it says, being a paper read by Edwin H. Blashfield at the first meeting of the Municipal Art Society and printed for circulation. Read by Edwin, but not written by Edwin. And yet the authorship of this speech is not credited anywhere. This is one of the few surviving copies of this text, which is found in the collection of the Little Compton Historical Society. In fact, the only place that I know for certain that it exists. In 1895, she co-wrote a book with other advocates for what is called the City Beautiful, a movement in American architecture and urban landscape design, which was tremendously influential in reshaping the cities of industrial America into livable spaces. And here, how to make New York a beautiful city. She lays out her vision for an art and a city, which is itself a form of public art, which is landscaped with parks and green spaces and is dotted with buildings of artistic beauty that nourish the souls and the experiences of the people who live in these spaces. As we all know, the daily and ordinary experience of beauty is one of the most powerful experiences of aesthetic moment in our lives. It's one thing to go to museums, it's lovely, but it's another thing to live with beauty. And that is what Evangeline envisioned as a civic and democratic responsibility of the designers of our nation. Here's Evangeline in middle age now in a drawing by Edwin. And here she is in an idealized study, which is a model, as we were talking about, for the Sakonnet Gulf sign, and as well for Edwin's works, including the color murals for the dome of the Library of Congress, which we see here. Evangeline is the image of France right here, holding a bill for the rights of the rights of men, les droits d'homme. Evangeline was a model for many of Edwin's paintings. She advanced the theory of urban construction, of a beautiful design, of a city endowed with public art, and Edwin painted it. Together, they were quite a powerful tandem. But I want to emphasize the importance of the intellectual motive for this, because these buildings at the private and the public level do not get built unless there are people with the ideas to make them come into being. There wasn't simply a universal move toward art. There was a move in response to a philosophy of public beauty in America at this crucial moment in the late 19th century. So Edwin becomes the great muralist and is remembered today as the dean of American muralists of the early 20th century. But Evangeline becomes a scholar in her own right. And as Edwin turns to mural painting, she turns to the history of women. This is really a groundbreaking essay that she wrote about one of the forgotten women artists of the past, a famous female artist in her lifetime that was largely forgotten in the years since, Rosalba Carriara, a miniature painter and who was one of the most successful painters and one of the first economically successful independent women artists, a businesswoman in her own right, which is what fascinated Evangeline. This is one of the first essays written about her in an American publication. Evangeline and Edwin published together Italian Cities, which is a monumental tome largely about the Renaissance and the Middle Ages and Italian city design that is inspired by her interest in urbanism and in sustainable urban design. An edition of the Lives of Vasari. Vasari is Lives of the Painters, a monumental 4-volume series, which Edwin acknowledges in his letters Evangeline was almost entirely responsible for herself. It was she who produced and corrected the translation. It was she who produced many of the annotations along with the co-authors. And then finally, we find Evangeline publishing in her own name her monumental history of women as artists, going back to the Middle Ages, to the 10th century monk, Hrotsvitha, who is remembered by history as the first playwright after antiquity, after the end of the Roman era. The first original playwright is this female nun, a German nun, Hrotsvitha, that was almost unknown and unpublished before Evangeline wrote her story, an astonishing and really vivid biography of the story of Charlotte Essay as well, a Circassian slave girl who was imported to France as chattel and who rose to become a courtier, but who lived a most conflicted and difficult life that reveals the difficulties of women in society. She is symptomatic as a slave, not simply of a literal kind of female bondage, but also of the condition of women in 18th century France as women who did not own themselves, even when they were not actually slaves. A fascinating feminist portrayal of a figure who is still today underknown, little regarded, and has largely been forgotten. Likewise, of the playwright Aphra Behn, who is regarded as the first female author of the modern era, and a tremendously important figure in modern feminist history and literature studies. She is also the author of the first abolitionist text, the first abolitionist fiction, Orinoco, a story of an African prince enslaved and brought to South America, who is killed and martyred in this telling. A really remarkable text. And finally, after her death, she died in 1918, is in the wake of the flu pandemic. Posthumously, Edwin Blashfield brought out her Manon Philippon Roland, the story of Madame Roland, the French revolutionary who was executed in 1793, at the hands of the revolutionaries that she had led to victory intellectually. But it was the story of Aphra Behn that I want to leave you with here today. It is a really interesting and a troubling but fascinating story in itself. Aphra Behn, who may not be known to you, as I say, is nevertheless a monument today in literature studies and the history of women. She's regarded as the first female author to earn her living independently by writing. She wrote in the 1670s and 1680s and was arguably the most successful writer of plays during this period in England, in an England which was absolutely besotted by theater. Aphra Behn, painted here by Sir Peter Lely, the great portraitist of the day, led a fascinating life in her own right. She was a spy. She'd lived in South America. She supported herself, which in its own way was a scandalous distinction in London in the day. As I say, Aphra Behn is well remembered, and Evangeline wrote the first great history of Aphra Behn's life. But this is completely unknown today because of an astonishing theft. Vita Sackville West, who was an author and a memoirist, and also the lover of Virginia Woolf, stole Evangeline's work, plagiarized her text on Aphra Behn, which was published in 1917. 10 years later, Vida Sackville-West produced her own biography of Aphra Behn, which is based largely on Evangeline's text. Evangeline, who had been dead 10 years and who had lapsed already into obscurity as a woman author, writing about a woman author who at that time no one cared about. It was 1918, it was the pandemic, it was the end of World War I, and the feminism, the incipient feminism of the 1920s, the change in women's status and roles had not yet hit in Evangeline's day, 2 years before the passage of suffrage in America. Her work was completely unknown, except to Vida Sackville-West, who obtained a copy of Evangeline's text through a mutual friend. That long ago time at Broadway in 1886, when Evangeline and Edwin were together with the artists Frank Millet and John Singer Sargent, they encountered a friend there, a man named Edmund Gosse, who was the foremost literary critic in England at the time and throughout the early 20th century. Edmund Gosse helped Vida Sackville-West write this biography of Aphra Behn and provided her with a copy of Evangeline's text, which is cited nowhere in Vida's book. Vida wrote it in part to impress Virginia, who was deeply intellectual. Vida was not, arguably. In fact, Vida, a fiction writer and memoirist, was somewhat intimidated by Virginia's deep and profound intellectual feminism and wrote this biography, a very winning biography based entirely on Evangeline's winning biography of Aphra Behn to impress her girlfriend. So a theft by a woman which erased the memory of a woman who had devoted her life to recovering the memories of women who had been forgotten. It's an extraordinary story and one that has yet to be revealed to the world, or I guess it has been here tonight. Evangeline Blashfield, we return to the pictures of her in her memorial. Evangeline, who had founded the Municipal Art Society in 1893, who wrote the address that articulated its principles and that marked its inauguration, an address that was delivered by her husband, an address that she's never received credit for, was allowed to become the first female member of the Municipal Art Society only in 1916, just 2 years before her death. And she died. When she died, she was working to obtain a fountain for this very spot. Her goal had been to erect a fountain that would provide water for the horses of the tradesmen who came every day across the Queensborough Bridge, trucking through the muck and the mire, to bring their vegetables to the Bridge Market, Green Market, which was located beneath the bridge. The area was unpaved and unimproved, and it exemplified everything about the city that Evangeline wanted to build up, to repair, to remediate, to beautify. She said, these men need at least fresh drinking water for their horses. And so after she died, the Municipal Art Society commissioned this monument designed by Edwin in her honor and bearing her image, based on that ancient long ago image, it seems ancient, from 1918 to 1881 of the young Evangeline, the figure of abundance, still fruitfully nourishing the world around her long after her death. I hope that will be true. I look forward to taking your questions here at the end of our talk. So thank you again for having me. Any questions about Evangeline or her past or her contributions or any other aspect of the talk, I'd be delighted to receive.
Did Evangeline interact with Frederick Law Olmsted and the movement for outdoor beauty?
Yes, so of course, she knew everyone. And there is among Edwin's effects, there is a handwritten list of quotes from letters of condolence that Edwin had received after her death from an astonishing array of architects and artists and thinkers and educators and authors and poets and actors and actresses. It's really an astonishing array. I don't know for a fact that she and Edwin interacted with Frank Olmsted, but I know that they did. Those were the circles that they ran in with the architects, the landscape designers of the day. And so again, I don't know for a fact, But this image of the city beautiful, I mean, this is the title of the book that she wrote, How to Make Our City a Beautiful City. And that the Olmsted firm's involvement in the outdoor public beauty, the idea of the city beautiful, is integral to Evangeline's work there in the 1890s.
Can you tell us about Evangeline's son?
So yes, I mean, I can only tell you what I know, which is very little. It's mentioned nowhere in any of the letters, any of Edwin's effects and Edwin's letters. It's mentioned nowhere, and we don't retain many materials from Evangeline. In fact, put the feelers out, guys. I've not given up hope that we'll find the Evangeline Wilbour Blashfield papers. There are various letters and notes, and Edwin saved a few things, but remarkably few. I have the feeling that he destroyed them. I have the feeling that Edwin disposed of at some point the bulk of her papers. He remarried, and so we probably have lost some things. Or it could have been destroyed by somebody like Theodora Wilbour. That is, Dora became her sister, younger sister, became the head of the family eventually. And Dora, at the end of her life, did not show much interest in preserving some things, as Marjorie can probably tell us more. But she did have a child, and it appears that she had a child very late in her maternal, fertile years. I think that it looks like 1901. And so she would have been, perhaps 40, in her 40s, early 40s. It appears that the child did not live very long at all. And there is, however, there's a gravestone in Woodlawn Cemetery with the family that indicates she did have a child. Edwin does say, and this is very touching in the biography, he says that throughout her life, she had a special affection for small children, especially for little boys. And she was constantly mothering little boys on their trips. Poor little Italian, boys who would guide them to places for a few pennies. She would take them and dress them and feed them and make sure they were well fed and take care of them. I think there's a touching reflection there of a maternal loss. But that's all we know about her son.
Where did Edwin and Evangeline live in New York City?
So they lived at 57th Street, and they kept that place for a very long time. Of course, they lived abroad for a long time. And I have to be perfectly honest, I don't remember, I can't recall, I must have run across it somewhere, where they lived, because eventually they moved from the 57th Street place, which was a studio after all. They were quite poor for a while, although Charles Edwin had a lot of money. She brought no money with her to the marriage. And it wasn't until the decease of her father and mother that she received a significant bequest from the estate. Thereafter, all of the children were wealthy, although that seemed to magnify problems for some of them rather than resolve them. But Evangeline was quite wealthy after the death of her mother. And yes, I don't know where they lived in their later years.
How often did they visit Little Compton?
So in their early years, they came every summer. In fact, Edwin built a studio, a glass house studio on the Awashanks property to paint in the summertime. And so after they were first married and back in the United States, the summers of 82, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, from 86 on, they lived abroad until 1893. But then, of course, would return to Little Compton throughout the summers. Their parents still lived there, and Charles Edwin, until his death at the end of the 19th century, had a routine where they would spend summer in Little Compton, and then he would go to Europe, and then he would winter in Egypt, and then come back for summer in Little Compton. So the family remained regulars in Little Compton until until Evangeline's death, I assume.
There's one more. Where are most of Edwin's paintings located now?
Most of them are in public buildings. So in fact, he stopped painting easel paintings almost entirely after 1893. his services were so in demand for these big, prominent, nationally important mural commissions. The Dome of the Library of Congress, the cathedral in Washington, D.C., Capitol buildings from Iowa and Minnesota and all over the world, the Detroit Public Library, huge commissions. And so that was really where his fame and glory lay. In fact, mural painting became, for a period of decades around the turn of the 20th century, became the most prestigious field of painting in American art. So his easel paintings are today almost unknown. In fact, I'm virtually the only person who knows anything about them. They are scattered around. There are a few in museum collections, but most of them are in private hands, like the painting that belongs to my friend. They tend to be rather small. They're from early in his career, and they had to be small to be saleable. That is, smaller, more affordable works were the kinds of things a young artist who was establishing his name needed to produce in large quantities. So they are spread around, and most of them we know about primarily through auction accounts, through auction records, when one comes up for sale and enters into the public domain as a fact of its existence and its sale. There are
a few. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I said I've tracked down about 70 easel paintings by Edwin, all but a handful from the era before 1888, 89. And the ones that are in museum collections tend to be the really big ones that he produced right around 1890 before he became a muralist.
Right. And those would have been more readily saved because he was, people might have gotten those, and then all of a sudden he was launched into being so publicly known, they suddenly realized they had something.
Well, in fact, most of those entered museum collections at the end of Edwin's life, when he began giving away paintings which he had not sold, but which he had kept in his studio. He had a massive studio up at Carnegie Hall, in the studios there. He had a huge studio. It was a glorious place, filled with these massive paintings that he kept as memory pieces, as reminders. It was a glorious space. And he began giving those away. Of course, he was such a famous and important painter in his lifetime that museum collections were glad to get them. His largest painting is at the Brooklyn Museum, but it hasn't been exhibited ever, I think, as far as I know. And then the irony there is that then Edwin, who was so famous at the end of his life, really the dean of American painters in some ways, dies, and he lived long enough to outlive his style. So by the time he died, he was really seen by the painters who mattered as this old fogey, as a relic. And so while he was remembered as this important figure in his own lifetime, art had moved on profoundly. He dies in 1936. This is the moment of Jackson Pollock. The two can't be farther apart. And so it's also, interestingly, he dies in the Great Depression, which is the end of the great period of American public art. And art becomes again just what Evangeline feared it would be, the toy of the rich man. That is, that the only people who would care about art, or who would have access to art or access to beauty, would be privately wealthy individuals who could build their own houses and assemble their collections and have their private gardens and live much as we live today, fulfilling the dangerous prophecy that she envisioned of a society with unequal aesthetic access. I think Evangeline envisioned art, and public art in particular, as a right, a democratic right, and a civic virtue. Think of it. Do we want to live in a beautiful place, in a beautiful country, in a beautiful city, or not? And is that something that dignifies the life lived by a citizen? That was Evangeline's question. It's a great question.
How was the WPA mural effort during the Depression influenced by Edwin?
Came directly out of Edwin and his crowd. The only reason that all of those WPA murals and the great murals, many of which have a different style and have a socialist, Depression era agenda, they nevertheless have Edwin and John Singer Sargent and Frank Millet to thank for their existence, because it was the tradition of mural painting which they established as this urgently important public art form an art form that should be supported by the public, that should be sustained by the public, and that should treat the themes that were interesting to the public. I think Edwin, he felt a little bit cast aside because people were critical of him and his generation in the style and the culture that had shifted and changed. But he absolutely made that possible. And I think he was delighted that there was a continuing investment in that kind of public beauty, which we rarely make an investment in now.
A couple of people want to know when you're writing the book about this.
Yeah, it is in progress, but I unfortunately have another book I'm writing. I'm now an Evangeline scholar, but I'm a medievalist by trade, and I have a medieval art history book that I've been working on for a couple of years that I'm trying to finish. But I would love it to be done now. I think so highly of her. She's an astonishing figure, and she has been the great intellectual inspiration to me for the last 2 years. So I look forward to bringing this into print.
Right, and especially in a time where there's kind of a crisis in arts funding as people kind of pare back to the basics.
Yes.
Her arguments about beauty as a public good is right there with it.
Does it matter whether people across the racial, the geographic, the social, the class divides in our country have access to beauty, have access to aesthetically dignified ways of living? Does it matter whether the schools that our kids go to are well built and attractive and fill them with a sense of purpose and dignity? Does it matter whether our city centers serve a public, or are we just a nation of HOAs and private goods? That was her anxiety in the late 19th century, at the moment when industrialization in America and the enormous wealth of the country concentrated in the hands of private individuals. The nation was asking this question: do we have a responsibility, given our prosperity, to care for the aesthetic lives of all people? Does beauty matter?
Well, thank you so much for your presentation tonight, Scott. It was fantastic. Thank you to everyone for coming, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. My pleasure.